If Ukraine falls, NATO will burn. That's the dire warning Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy delivered during an interview at the Munich Security Conference. His message was simple: Putin won't stop at Ukraine. He'll target the rest of Europe next, and he may even be able to do it without the United States getting involved. Putin is waiting for NATO to be weakened, and Russia's leader cannot be trusted. But why does Zelenskyy think that Russia wants a war against NATO? What would allow that war to happen? And what would the outcome of that war actually be? We start with Zelenskyy's comments. As Ukraine's president spoke to reporters in Munich, he pointed out that US President Donald Trump has the leverage to push Putin towards ceasefire negotiations. However, Putin can't be trusted. Even if he comes to the table with Ukraine involved, he still has expansionist desires, and he might break the conditions of a truce at a moment's notice. If that happens, it will be a sign that Putin isn't ready to stop at Ukraine. The rest of Europe, which accounts for most of NATO, will be next. We believe that Putin will wage war against NATO, Zelenskyy told the reporters. In addition to suggesting that Russia's leader is waiting for a weakened NATO. How could NATO be weakened? By the possibility that the United States of America will think to take its military from Europe. Zelenskyy's warning is twofold. Europe can't trust Putin to keep his word, and it can't rely on the United States to come to its rescue should Putin look beyond Ukraine. I don't know if they will want 30% of Europe, 50%, I don't know. Nobody knows, but they will have this possibility, said Ukraine's leader when referring to a situation in which Ukraine falls and the United States isn't around to help. The words echoed those Zelenskyy spoke at the Munich Security Conference itself, where he told Europe's leaders that we can't rule out the possibility that America might say no to Europe on issues that threaten it. So it appears that we have two conditions that must be met if Russia is to wage war on NATO. First, the US must either withdraw from the alliance or refuse to aid its NATO partners, even if a Russian invasion triggers Article 5 of the NATO Charter. Second, Putin must have the desire to claim more of Europe if he's successful in Ukraine. The question now is simple: could those two conditions be met? The short answer is yes. It's a possibility that Russia could wage war on Europe, and the US wouldn't intervene. Starting with the weakening of NATO, the concept of Trump removing the US from the coalition is far from new. Back in 2018, during Trump's first stint as US president, Trump reportedly told senior administration officials several times that he desired the removal of the US from NATO. Those statements included claims that Trump didn't see the point of maintaining such a large military alliance, especially as he believed that the existence of NATO was a drain on America's resources. A year before, Trump had also started telling NATO members that it was time to pay their way. During a NATO meeting in Brussels, he said that massive amounts of money were owed to the US by the other members of the coalition, while pointing out that many of NATO's members fall well short of the defense spending of 2% of gross domestic product, or GDP, that NATO recommends. And he was right. In 2017, only 4 nations were meeting what Trump believed was an obligation more than a recommendation. Those countries were Estonia, which spent 2.01% of its GDP on defense, Greece, with 2.38%, the UK, which spent 2.06%, and of course, the United States as the highest spender at 3.31%. At the time, NATO had 29 members, meaning less than 14% of its members were hitting the 2% recommendation. Trump's argument at the time seemed fairly simple: pay up or the US is gone. NATO has changed its tack. Fast forward to 2024 and NATO has expanded to include 32 members. Of those members, 23 are hitting the target of at least 2% of GDP spending on their defense. It's not a perfect record. Around 2/3 of NATO allies are hitting the target, but that's a lot better than the 14% or so of 2017, which would suggest that Trump was getting his way. America's NATO allies were starting to spend at similar levels, at least in terms of GDP, as the United States. The problem for Europe, and the reason why Zelenskyy is warning that Russia is preparing to wage war on NATO, is that Trump may not have changed his views on the US leaving the alliance. On February 14th, the UK Defense Journal reported on comments made by former US National Security Advisor John Bolton, who served under Trump during his first presidential term. He suggests that Trump is now moving the goalpost to keep the door open for the removal of the US from NATO. First, he said back in his initial term, well, all these Europeans are not spending 2% of GDP on defense. Now he's saying you need to spend 5% of GDP on defense, Bolton said. He's referring to comments made by Trump in early January 2025, when America's president claimed that NATO should have a 5% target. They can all afford it, said Trump, but they should be at 5%, not 2%. Note that Trump didn't say "we" here. He talked about NATO as a separate entity from the United States, acting as though all the other members should hit a new 5% target from which America is immune. The US also doesn't spend 5% of its GDP on defense either, with the country hitting 3.4% of GDP expenditure in 2024. That puts it about level with Estonia. also at 3.4% and quite a way behind Poland, which spent 4.1% of its GDP on its military. Bolton actually agrees with Trump's comments to an extent. He says that he believes the US itself isn't spending enough in a challenging world. However, he also points out that Trump's call for 5% may be an interesting goal. I suspect there's almost no country in Europe, maybe the Baltics and Poland and a few others, that will go to 5%. So in a year when it doesn't happen, Trump will be able to say, NATO is just as worthless as I always said it was, I'm getting out. In other words, Trump has moved the spending goalpost now so that more European NATO members are hitting the 2% target, and he's doing it because he sees it as a route for pulling the US out of the alliance. There's only one potential saving grace for NATO's European members. The US Congress stands as the guardrail that keeps America in the coalition. Any decision to leave has to first pass through Congress before it can be made a reality. Former US President Joe Biden signed that requirement into law as part of the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, which may have been Biden's subtle way of preparing for the possibility of a Trump presidency. The problem is that the law isn't airtight. This is not open and shut, claims Brookings Institution scholar and senior editor of Lawfare Scott Anderson. This is about Congress telling you that you can't do this, and if you ignore Congress, you're going to have to fight us in the courts over it, he says. Therein lies the problem. For the issue to be litigated, Anderson claims, there needs to be someone with standing to sue. That someone could be Congress, only it's not clear if the Republicans in Congress would be willing to launch a lawsuit against their own elected president. So Zelenskyy is right to worry about NATO no longer having the US as a partner. Trump has threatened withdrawal in the past. He's moving the spending goalposts to a level that may be unreachable for many of the alliance's members. Plus, the laws in place to force congressional approval of a withdrawal aren't as solid as they need to be. But what about Putin? With NATO weakened by a US withdrawal, would he really set his sights on the rest of Europe? Again, it's a possibility. Suggestions that Putin's appetite for expansion may extend beyond Ukraine have existed since at least February 2023. That's when RAND published an article where it claimed that Putin's next goal may be to attack other post-Soviet neighbors who were previously part of Russia's empire. And Putin has a history in that respect. He invaded Georgia in 2008, soon after then Prime Minister Putin had told former US President George W. Bush that Ukraine is not even a country. Of course, Putin invaded Crimea in 2014, following that up with his special military operation against Ukraine in 2022. In the same year, he also claimed that Kazakhs never had statehood, but perhaps his most worrying claim came in 2016. Russia's president said that his country's border had no end. In May 2024, Philip Reeves of NPR's Morning Edition noted that many in Estonia fear Putin could target them next if he's victorious in Ukraine. Putin could seek to test NATO and Article 5 by entering the Baltics despite the risk of triggering nuclear war, claimed Reeves, noting that Estonians were protesting Putin's war in Ukraine outside the Russian embassy in Estonia's Tallinn at the time. It's also notable that about a quarter of Estonia's population are ethnic Russians, which could serve as ammunition for a future Putin claim that Estonia should be part of his country. The Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies also notes that Putin may be so hell-bent on expansion that he would invade European NATO nations even if the US remains part of the alliance. No one knows what Putin would do next if he were emboldened by a victory against Ukraine. And although analysts downplay the possibility of Putin attacking a Baltic state such as Estonia, Putin has surprised the world before. He did so when he invaded Ukraine. Worse yet, according to the Institute, Putin both dislikes NATO and doesn't fear an attack from the alliance. Rather, he's frustrated that NATO constrains him and prevents him from restoring what he sees as the true Russia. He's already engaged in hybrid warfare with many NATO countries, including using disinformation campaigns, sabotage, and cyber attacks to get his way. Would he go a step further and use military force? Perhaps if Russia defeats Ukraine and has a couple of years to rebuild its military capabilities, and if Trump has pulled the US out of NATO by then, the possibility of Putin following through on his expansionist desires becomes much higher. Ukraine certainly thinks that's a possibility. In October 2023, President Zelenskyy said that Putin is considering various scenarios for the coming years while highlighting 2028 as the potential year that Putin will attack a NATO-aligned nation. If Russia is allowed to adapt now, said Zelenskyy, then in 2028 the Kremlin will be able to restore the military potential Ukraine has destroyed, and Russia will have enough power to attack the countries that are the focus of Russian expansion. Like many before him, Zelenskyy highlighted the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as being particularly at risk. This is clear information from our intelligence, and we signal it to you, Zelenskyy concluded. There's also the Trump factor to consider in all of this. Beyond the possibility that Trump may pull the US out of NATO, America's president has been sending some decidedly mixed messages to Ukraine over the last few weeks. Ukraine's president has had conversations with Trump during which he warned the US president that Putin is a liar. Putin doesn't want any peace, Zelenskyy told Trump. Ukraine's president also believes that Putin is a little bit scared of Trump, with that fear being potential leverage Trump could use to push Putin toward peace negotiations. The Kyiv Post also points out that US officials have assured Ukraine that America won't simply wash its hands of Ukraine's plight after it's spent 3 years battling against Russia. All of these seem like pro-Trump and pro-Ukraine messages, but on February 18th, Trump also held supposed peace talks with Putin in Saudi Arabia without any Ukrainian involvement. To Ukraine, that would look like the US attempting to cut them out of any deal that's being made, running contrary to the previous claims that America won't leave Ukraine behind. Trump was even quoted as being disappointed by Ukraine's reaction of surprise to not being invited to the talks, with Trump also saying that Zelenskyy could have made a deal earlier in the conflict. I hear that they're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. Trump even appeared to blame Ukraine for the conflict, adding, "You should have never started it. You could have made a deal." Is it any wonder that Zelenskyy is now warning NATO's European members that they face an imminent threat? Many believe that Putin wants to invade the Baltic states next, with Ukraine's own intelligence suggesting as much. Trump is sending mixed messages to Zelenskyy, and there's still the possibility that the US will withdraw from NATO to consider. If that happens, NATO's nuclear threat diminishes enormously, leaving only France and Britain as the nations capable of striking Russia with nukes, which would further open the door for a Russian war against what remains of NATO. The question now is simple: is NATO ready for that war? It depends on who you ask. In June 2024, the UK Defence Journal stacked NATO without the US against Russia in an in-depth analysis. It pointed out that the combined strength of NATO's members without the US is far higher than Ukraine's when Russia invaded in February 2022. On the personnel front, NATO without America has 1.5 million active military personnel, which matches up well with the 1.32 million active soldiers Russia currently has. It's also worth noting that Russia has churned through over 862,000 troops in Ukraine, leaving it with a military predominantly made up of inexperienced conscripts, contract mercenaries, and even soldiers from other countries such as North Korea. NATO also has access to more advanced technology than Russia, the journal argues. Europe's NATO members have invested heavily in next-generation aircraft, cyber defenses, and precision-guided munitions, all of which make the collective a viable and powerful foe for Russia to take on. Of course, this also assumes that these NATO members will all respond with military force should Putin attack another NATO member, such as one of the Baltic states. However, this version of NATO would also miss the US dramatically. Its nuclear threat would be cut down, with France and Britain combining to have 515 nuclear warheads, compared to Russia's 1,549 strategic nukes and its remaining stockpile of 4,380. If Putin reaches for the nuclear button, he could devastate all NATO nations at once. France and Britain could do the same to Russia, though with less firepower than it would have if the US brought its 5,225 nuclear warheads to the engagement. European NATO also relies heavily on the US for operational intelligence and missile defense. Plus, America's large stockpile of aerial tankers would be missed, as these important aircraft are in short supply in Europe and would prove vital for keeping NATO's more powerful aerial forces refueled for assaults against Russia. The journal's conclusion is that NATO without the US could fend off a Russian attack well during the first few months, causing massive damage to Putin's forces. But what happens months down the line when Russia is still coming and NATO has depleted a large portion of its munitions? A February 2025 examination of the same topic by UK Defence Journal mentions the same issues. Again, the conclusion is that European NATO, and the continent as a whole, could mount a robust defence against Putin's forces. However, sustaining operations beyond the opening phases of such a war would see this America-less version of NATO struggle without the intelligence, logistical, and technical support the US has long provided. The NATO members that would be on the front lines in a war against Russia are even less confident. In December 2024, leaders from Latvia, Estonia, and Finland all made the same claim that NATO is not ready to fight against Russia without US involvement. "That's absolutely clear," said Latvian President Edgars Rinkēvičs. "We can't keep simply hoping for a situation where the US remains much involved in Europe." Estonian Prime Minister Kristen Michal added, "We have to ramp up our defense capabilities because of Russia's threat and its inability to be a democracy and operate in a rule-based world." It's worth noting that Estonia and Latvia spent 3.4% and 3.15% of their GDP on defense as of 2024. Finland has also broken through NATO's 2% target, spending 2.4% of its GDP. Those European NATO nations are taking the Russian threat seriously. Perhaps the problem is that the rest of NATO isn't doing the same. And it's that discoordination between NATO's European members that could be the alliance's undoing if Trump withdraws the US from the coalition. European NATO has the numbers and equipment to match Russia. However, if it gets bogged down in bureaucracy and debates on how to react to a Russian victory against Ukraine, it could leave itself open to being caught out. That's why NATO might burn if Ukraine falls, as Zelenskyy claims. So what's the solution? Ukraine's president believes he has one: the formation of a new European army. "I really believe that time has come. The armed forces of Europe must be created," Zelenskyy said to journalists outside the Munich Security Conference. Ukraine's president has pushed for this sort of unified European force for several years, with little progress. He also isn't clear on what the force would look like, which only adds to the challenge NATO's European members face. Royal United Service Institute Director Matthew Saville suggests that establishing a land deterrence force of 100,000 to 150,000 soldiers could effectively respond to any renewed Russian aggression, particularly if a ceasefire in Ukraine is reached. However, without US involvement, Saville believes it would be challenging to persuade nations distant from Russia's borders to commit such significant troop numbers, potentially compromising their own defenses. Alternatively, Saville proposes the formation of a tripwire force, smaller than the full deterrence force but still comprising tens of thousands of European troops stationed along critical front lines. This contingent would serve as a rapid response unit, deterring further Russian advances and ensuring that any attack would trigger a broader European military reaction. Then we have former NATO advisor Jamie Shea acknowledging the difficulties Europe faces in assembling such forces, but emphasizes their necessity to contain Russia's threat within Ukraine. He advocates for an active force of 50,000 soldiers operating in seamless rotations, requiring a total commitment of 150,000 troops to maintain a continuous deterrent presence. None of these proposals consider the possibility of European NATO starting a full-blown war against Putin over what he's done in Ukraine. It's all about deterrence, with numbers that are significantly lower than the 1.5 million troops the combined European NATO forces could bring to a fight. And there's also conflict among Europe's NATO members to consider. France, the UK and Sweden have all indicated a willingness to send troops to the front lines if necessary. However, with the recent election of Friedrich Merz as Germany's Chancellor on February 23, 2025, there is a potential shift in Germany's stance. Merz has emphasized the need for Europe to strengthen its own defense capabilities, expressing doubts about NATO's future in its current form. This could lead to a more proactive German role in European defense initiatives, but will that be enough? If European NATO isn't united against Putin, as is the case right now, then Zelenskyy might be right. NATO might burn, especially without US involvement, and it would lose a war with Russia not because it doesn't have the soldiers or the equipment, but because of the combined issues of a lack of cooperation and the loss of America's supporting intelligence and logistics. But what do you think NATO's chances are against Russia? Will the US withdraw from the alliance, leaving European NATO to fend for itself? And is the threat to NATO as imminent as Zelenskyy claims? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.